The dark is rising. Day 5, Part 1, Christmas Day. When he knelt beside the Christmas tree and pulled off the gay paper wrapping from the giant box labeled Will, the first thing he discovered was that it was not a box at all, but a wooden crate. A Christmas choir warbled distant and joyful from the radio in the kitchen. It was the after Christmas stocking, before breakfast gathering of the family, when each member opened just one of his tree presents. The rest of the bright pile would lie there until after dinner, happily tantalizing. Will, being the youngest, had the first turn. He had made a beeline for the box, partly because it was so impressively large, and partly because he suspected it came from Stephen. He found that someone had taken the nails out of the wooden lid so that he could open it easily. Robin pulled out the nails, and Bar and I put the paper on, said Mary at his shoulder, all agog. But we didn't look inside. Come on, Will, come on. He took off the lid. It was full of dead leaves, or reeds, or something. Palm leaves, said his father, looking. For packaging, I suppose. Mind your fingers. They can have sharp edges. Mark tugged out handfuls of the rustling fronds until the first hard shape of something began to show. It was a thin, strange, curving shape, brown, smooth, like a branch. It seemed to be made of a hard kind of paper mache. It was an antler, like and yet not like the antler of a deer. Will paused suddenly. A strong and totally unexpected feeling had leapt out at him when he touched the antler. It was not a feeling he had ever had in the presence of the family before. It was the mixture of excitement, security, and delight that came over him whenever he was with one of the old ones. He saw an envelope poking out of the packing beside the antler and opened it. That paper bore the neat letterhead of Stephen's ship. Dear Will, happy birthday, happy Christmas. I always swore never to combine the two, didn't I? And here I am, doing it. Let me tell you why. I don't know whether you'll understand, especially after you see what the present is, but perhaps you will. You've always been a bit different from everybody else. I don't mean daft, just different. It was like this. I was in the oldest part of Kingston one day during Carnival. Carnival in these islands is a very special time. Great fun, with echoes going back a long, long way. Anyway, I got mixed up in a procession, all laughing people and then jingling steel bands and dancers in wild costumes, and I met an old man. He was a very impressive old man, his skin very black and his hair very white, and he sort of appeared out of nowhere and took me by the arm and pulled me out of the dancing. I'd never seen him in my life before, anywhere, I'm sure of it, but he looked at me and he said, You are Stephen Stanton of Her Majesty's Navy. I have something for you. Not for you yourself, but for your youngest brother, the seventh son. You will send it to him as a present for his birthday this year and his Christmas, combined in one. It will be a gift from you, his brother, and he will know what to do with it in due course, although you will not. It will also it was also unexpected. It really knocked me off balance. All I could say was, Who are you? How do you know me? And the old man just looked at me again with very dark, deep eyes that seemed to be looking through me into the day after tomorrow. And he said, I would know you anywhere. You are Will Stanton's brother. There is a look that we old ones have. Our families have something of it, too. And that was about it, Will. He didn't say another word. That last bit makes no sense, I know, but that was what he said. Then he just moved into the carnival procession and out again, and when he came out he was wearing, actually, the thing you will find in this box. So here I am sending it to you, just as I was told. It seems mad, and I can think of lots of things you'd have liked better, but there it is. There was something extraordinary about that old man, and I just somehow had to do what he told me. Hope you like your crazy present, mate. I'll be thinking of you both days. Love, Stephen. Slowly, Will folded the letter and put it back into its envelope. A look that we old ones have, so the circle stretched all the way around the world. But of course it did. There would be no point in it otherwise. He was glad to have Stephen part of the pattern. It was right, somehow. Oh, come on, Will. When Mary was hopping with curiosity, her dressing gown flapping. Open it, open it. Will suddenly realized that his tradition-minded family had been standing, patiently, immobile, waiting for 5 minutes while he read his letter. Using the lid of the crate as a tray, he hastily began hauling out more and more palm leaf packing, until finally the object inside was clear. He pulled it out, staggering as he took the weight, and everybody gasped. It was a giant carnival head, brilliant and grotesque. The colors were bright and crude, the features boldly made and easily recognizable, all done in the same smooth, light substance like papier-mâché or a kind of grainless wood. And it was not the head of a man. Will had never seen anything like it before. The head from which the branching antlers sprang was shaped like the head of a stag, but the ears, beside the horns, were those of a dog or a wolf, and the face beneath the horns was a human face, but with the round, feather-edged eyes of a bird. There was a strong, straight human nose, a firm human mouth, set in a slight smile. There was not much else that was purely human about the thing at all. The chin was bearded, but the bearded so shaped that it might as easily have been the chin of a goat or deer as of a man. The face could have been frightening. When everyone had gasped, the sound Mary made and hastily muffled had been more like a small scream. But Will felt that its effect would depend on who was looking at it. The appearance was nothing. It was neither ugly nor beautiful, frightening nor funny. It was a thing made to call out deep responses from the mind. It was very much a thing of the old ones. "My word," his father said. "That's a funny sort of present," said James. His mother said nothing. Mary said nothing, but edged away a little. "Reminds me of someone I know," Robin said, grinning. Paul said nothing. Gwen said nothing. Max said softly, "Look at those eyes." Barbara said, "But what's it for?" Will ran his fingers over the strange great face. It took him only a moment to find what he was looking for. It was almost invisible unless you were expecting it. Engraved on the forehead, between the horns, the imprint of a circle, quartered by a cross. He said, "It's a West Indian carnival head. It's old. It's special. Stephen found it in Jamaica." James was beside him now, peering up inside the head. "There's a kind of wire framework that rests on your shoulders, and a slit where the mouth's just a bit open. I suppose you look through that. Come on, Will, put it on." He heaved up the head from behind to slip it over Will's shoulders, but Will drew away, as some other part of his mind spoke silently to him. "Not now," he said. Somebody else opened their present. Mary forgot the head and her reaction to it, in the happy instant of finding that it was her turn for Christmas. She dived at the pile of presents by the tree, and the cheerful discoveries began again. One present each. They had almost done, and it was almost time for breakfast when the knocking came at the front door. Mrs. Stanton had been about to reach for her own ritual parcel. Her arm dropped to her side, and she looked up blankly. Who on earth could that be? They all stared at one another and then at the door, as if it might speak. This was all wrong, like a phrase of music changing in mid-melody. Nobody ever came to the house at this hour on Christmas Day. It was not in the pattern. "I wonder," said Mr. Stanton, with a faint surmise waking in his voice, and he pushed his feet more firmly into his slippers and got up to open the front door. They heard the door open. His back filled the space and stopped them from seeing the visitor, but his voice rose in obvious pleasure. "My dear chap, how very good of you. Come in. Do come in." And as he turned back towards the living room, he was holding a small package in one hand that had not been there before, clearly a product of the tall figure that now loomed in the doorway, following him in. Mr. Stanton was beaming and glowing, busy with introductions. "Alice, love, this is Mr. Middleton. So kind, all this way on Christmas morning, just to deliver. Shouldn't have taken the Middleton, my son Max, my daughter, Gwen, James, Barbara." Will listened without attention to the grown-up politeness. It was only at the voice of the stranger that he glanced up. There was something familiar in the deep, slightly nasal voice, with a trace of accent, carefully repeating the names. "How do you do, Mrs. Stanton? Compliments of the season to you, Max, Gwen." And Will saw the outline of the face and the longish red-brown hair, and he froze. It was the writer, this Mr. Middleton, his father's friend from goodness knows where, was the black writer from somewhere outside time. Will seized the nearest thing to his hand. A sweep of bright cloth that was Stephen's present came from Jamaica to his sister, Barbara, and pulled it quickly over the carnival head to mask it from view. As he turned again, the writer raised his head to look further back into the room, and he saw him. He stared at Will in open, triumphant challenge, a small smile on his lips. Mr. Stanton beckoned, flapping a hand. "Will, come here a minute, my youngest son. Mr. Will was instantly a furious old one, so furious but he did not pause to think what he should do. He could feel every inch of himself, as if he had grown in his rage to 3 times his own height. He stretched out his right hand, with its fingers spread stiff towards his family, and saw them instantly caught into a stop in time, frozen out of all movement. Like waxworks, they stood stiff and motionless round the room. "How dare you come in here?" he shouted at the writer. The two of them stood facing one another across the room, the only living and moving objects there. No human moved. The hands of the clock on the mantelpiece did not move, and though the flames of the fire flickered, they did not consume the logs that they burned. "How dare you at Christmas on Christmas morning? Get out!" It was the first time in his life he had ever felt such rage, and it was not pleasant. But he was outraged that the dark should have dared to interrupt his most precious family ritual. The writer said softly, "Contain yourself." In the old speech his accent was suddenly much more marked. He smiled at Will without a flicker of change in his cold blue eyes. "I can cross your threshold, my friend, and pass your buried holly, because I have been invited. Your father, in good faith, asked me to enter the door, and he is the master of this house, and there's nothing you can do about that." "Yes, there is," Will said, staring at the writer's confident smile. He focused all his powers in an effort to see into his mind, find what he intended to do there, but he came up sharp against a black wall of hostility, unbreakable. Will felt this should not be possible, and he was shaken. He groped angrily in his memory for the words of destruction with which, in the last resort, but only the very last resort, an old one might break the power of the dark, and the black writer laughed. "Oh no, Will Stanton," he said easily, "that won't do. You cannot use weapons of that kind here, not unless you wish to blast your whole family out beyond time." He glanced pointedly at Mary, who stood unmoving next to him, her mouth half open, caught out of life in the middle of saying something to her father. "That would be a pity," the writer said. Then he looked back at Will, and the smile dropped from his face as if he had spat it away, and his eyes narrowed. "You young fool, do you think that for all your gift of grammar you can control me? Keep your place. You are not one of the masters yet. You may do things as best you can contrive, but the high powers are not for your mastering yet, and nor am I." "You are afraid of my masters," Will said suddenly, not knowing quite what he meant, but knowing it was true. The writer's pale face flushed. He said softly, "The dark is rising, old one, and this time we do not propose that anything shall hinder its way. This is the time for our rising, and these next 12 months shall see us established at last. Tell your masters that. Tell them that nothing shall stop us. Tell them all the things of power that they hope to possess we shall take from them, the grail and the harp and the signs. We shall break your circle before it can ever be joined, and none shall stop the dark from rising." The last words came out in a high shriek of triumph, and Will shivered. The writer stared at him, his pale eyes glittering. Then scornfully he spread out his hands toward the Stantons, and at once they started into life again, and the bustle of Christmas was back, and there was nothing Will could do. "That box for you," Mary said. "Middleton, this is our Will." Mr. Stanton put his hand on Will's shoulder. Will said coldly, "How do you do?" "The compliments of the season to you, Will," the writer said. "I wish you the same as you wish me," Will said. "Very logical," said the writer. "Very pompous, if you ask me," Mary said, tossing her head. "He's like that sometimes, Daddy. Who is that box for that he brought?" "Mr. Middleton, not he," said her father automatically. "For your mother, a surprise," the writer said. "Something that wasn't finished last night in time for your father to bring it home." "From you?" "From Daddy, I think," said Mrs. Stanton, smiling at her husband. She turned to the writer. "Will you have breakfast with us, Mr. Middleton?" "He can't," said Will. "Will!" "He sees I'm in a hurry," the writer said smoothly. No, I thank you, Mrs. Stanton, but I am on the way to spend the day with friends, and I must be off." Mary said, "Where are you going?" "North of here." "What long hair you have, Mary. Very pretty." "Thank you," said Mary smugly, shaking her long, loose hair back from her shoulders. The writer reached out and removed a stray hair delicately from her sleeve. "Allow me," he said politely. "She's always showing it off," James said calmly. Mary stuck out her tongue. The writer looked down the room again. "That's a magnificent tree. A local one." "It's a royal tree," James said, "from the great park." Come and see. Mary grabbed the rider's hand and tugged him across. Will bit his lip and deliberately blanked out all thought of the carnival head from his mind by concentrating very hard on what he was likely to have for breakfast. The rider, he was fairly sure, could see into the top level of his mind, but not perhaps the ones buried deeper than that. But there was no danger. Though the great empty box and its pile of exotic packing stood right beside him, the rider, surrounded by Stanton, simply peered obediently and admiringly at the ornaments on the tree. He seemed particularly taken with the tiny carved initials from Farmer Dawson's box. Beautiful, he said, absently twirling Mary's leaf-twined M, which Will noticed vaguely was hanging upside down. Then he turned back to the presents. I really must go, and you must have your breakfast. Will looks rather hungry, I think. There was a flash of malice as they looked at one another, and Will knew that he had been right about the limits of the dark scene. I'm really immensely grateful to you, Middleton, Mr. Stanton said. No trouble at all. Were you right on my way? You were right on my way. Compliments of the season to you all. With a flurry of farewells, he was gone, striding down the path. Will rather regretted that his mother shut the door before they had a chance to hear a car's engine start up. He did not think the rider had come by car. Well, my love, said Mr. Stanton, giving his wife a kiss and handing her the box. Here's your first treat present. Happy Christmas. Oh, said her mother. Then she had it opened. Oh, Roger. Will squeezed past his burbling sisters to have a look. Nestled on white velvet in a box marked with the same of his father's shop was his mother's old-fashioned ring. The ring he had watched Mr. Stanton checking for loose stones some weeks before. The ring that Merriman had seen in the picture he took out of Will's mind. But encircling it was something else, a bracelet made as an enlargement of the ring, exactly matching it, a gold band set with 3 diamonds in the center and 3 rubies on either side, and engraved with an odd pattern of circles and lines and curves round them all. Will stared at it, wondering why the rider should have wanted to have it in his hands, for surely that must have been behind the visit this morning. No lord of the dark needed to enter any house merely to see what was inside. Did you make it, Dad? Said Max. Lovely bit of work. Thank you, said his father. Who is that man who brought it? Gwen said curiously. Does he work with you? Such a funny name. Oh, he's a dealer, Mr. Stanton said, in diamonds mostly. Strange chap, but very pleasant. I've known him for a couple of years, I suppose. We get quite a lot of stones from his people, including these. He poked one finger gently at the bracelet. I had to leave early yesterday with young Geoffrey, while young Geoffrey was still tightening one setting, and Middleton happened to be in the shop and offered to drop it off to save me coming back. As he said, he was coming past here this morning anyway. Still, it was good of him. He needn't have offered. Very nice, said his wife. But you're nicer. I think it's beautiful. I'm hungry, said James. When are we going to eat? It was only after the bacon and eggs, toast and tea, marmalade and honey were all gone, and the debris of his first present opening cleared away, that Will realized his letter from Stephen was nowhere to be found. He searched the living room, investigated everyone's belongings, crawled underneath the tree and around the waiting pile of still unopened presents, but it was not there. It might, of course, have been inadvertently thrown away in a mistake for wrapping paper. Such things sometimes happened in their crowded Christmas day. But Will thought he knew what had happened to his letter, and he wondered whether, after all, it had been the chance of investigating his mother's ring that had brought the Black Rider to the house, or a quest for something else. Before long they noticed that snow was falling again, gently but inexorably. The flakes came fluttering down without once faltering. The footprints of Mr. Middleton, out on the path from door to drive, were soon covered up or covered over as if they had never been there. The dogs, Rack and Cy, who had asked to go out before the snow began, came humbly scratching at the back door again. I'm all for a white Christmas now and then, said Max, staring morosely out, but this is ridiculous. Extraordinary, said his father, looking out over his shoulder. I've never known it like this at Christmas in my lifetime. If much more comes down today, there'll be real transport truck problems all over the south of England." "That's what I was thinking," said Max. "I suppose to be I'm supposed to be going to Southampton the day after tomorrow to stay with Deb." "Oh, whoa, whoa," said James, clutching his chest. Max looked at him. "Happy Christmas, Max," James said. Paul came clomping into the living room in boots, buttoning his overcoat. "Snow or no snow, I'm off ringing. The old bell's up in the thicky tower dawn. Wait for no one. Any of you heathen mob coming to church this morning?" "The Nightingales will be along," Max said, looking at Will and James, who between them constituted about 1/3 of the church choir. That should do you, don't you think?" "If you were to perform your seasonal good deed," said Gwen, passing, "with some useful task like peeling the potatoes, then perhaps Mum could go. She does like to, when she can." The small muffled group which set out eventually into the thickening snow consisted of Paul, James, Will, Mrs. Stanton, and Mary, who was, James said unkindly, but with truth, probably more interested in avoiding housework than in making her devotions. They plodded up the road, snowflakes coming down harder now and beginning to sting their cheeks. Paul had gone ahead to join the other ringers, and soon the tumbling notes of the 6 sweet old bells that hung in the small square tower began chiming through the gray whirling world around them, brightening it back into Christmas. Will's spirits rose a little at the sound, but not much. The heavy persistence of the new snow troubled him. He could not shake off the creeping suspicion that it was being sent as a forerunner of something else. By the dark, he thrust his hands deep into the pockets of his sheepskin jacket, and the fingertips of one hand found themselves curling round a rook's feather, forgotten since the dreadful night of Midwinter's Eve, before his birthday. In the snowy road, 4 or 5 cars stood outside the church. There were more, usually on Christmas morning, but few villagers outside walking range had chosen to brave the swirling white fog. Will watched the fat white flakes lie determined and unmelting on his jacket sleeve. It was very cold, even inside the little church. The snowflakes obstinately remained and took a long time to melt. He went with James and a handful of other choristers to struggle into their surplices into the narrow vestry corridor, and then, as the bells merged into the beginning of the service, to make the procession down the aisle and up into the little gallery at the back of the small square nave. You could see everyone from there, and it was clear that the church of St. James and the Less was not Christmas crammed this year, but half full. The order of morning prayer, as were in this church of England, and by the authority of Parliament in the 2nd year of the reign of King Edward VI, made its noble way through the Christmas pattern, led by the rector's unashamedly theatrical bass baritone. "O ye frost and cold, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever," sang Will, reflecting that Mr. Beaumont had shown a certain wry humor in choosing the canticle. "O ye ice and snow, blessed ye Lord, praise him and magnify him forever." Suddenly he found himself shivering, but not from the words, nor from any sense of cold. His head swam. He clutched for a moment in the edge of the gallery. The music seemed to become, for a brief flash, hideously discordant, jarring at his ears. Then it faded into itself again, and was as before, leaving Will shaken and chilled. "O ye light and darkness," sang James, staring at him. "Are you all right? Sit down and magnify him forever." But Will shook his head impatiently, and for the rest of the service he sturdily stood, sang, sat, or knelt, and convinced himself that there had been nothing at all wrong, except a vague feeling of faintness, brought on by what his elders liked to recall overexcitement. And then the strange sense of wrongness or discordance came again. It was only once more, at the very edge of the service, Mr. Beaumont was booming out the prayer of St. Chrysostom, whose dost promise that when 2 or 3 are gathered together in thy name, thou wilt grant their request. Noise broke suddenly into Will's mind, a shrieking and dreadful howling in the place of the familiar cadences. He had heard it before. It was the sound of the besieging dark, which he had heard outside the manor hall, where he had sat with Merriman and the lady in some century unknown. But in a church? Said Will with an angelic choir boy, incredulous. Surely you can't feel it inside a church. Ah, said Will, the old one, unhappily. Any church of any religion is vulnerable to their attack, for places like this are where men give thought to matters of the light and the dark. He hunched his head down between his shoulders as the noise beat at him, and then it vanished again, and the rector's voice was ringing out alone, as before. Will glanced quickly around him, but it was clear nobody else had noticed anything wrong. Through the folds of his white surplice he gripped the 3 signs on his belt, but there was neither warmth nor cold under his fingers. To the warning power of the signs, he guessed a church was a kind of no man's land. Since no harm could actually enter its walls, no warning against harm should be necessary. Yet, if the harm were hovering just outside. The service was over now, everyone roaring out, "O come, all ye faithful," in happy Christmas fervor, as the choir made their way down from the gallery and up to the altar. Then Mr. Beaumont's blessing went rolling out over the heads of the congregation. The love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost. But the words could not bring Will's peace, for he knew that something was wrong, something looming out of the dark, something waiting out there, and that when it came to the point he must meet it alone, unstrengthened. He watched everyone file beaming out of the church, smiling and nodding to each other as they gripped their umbrellas and turned up their collars against the swirling snow. He saw jolly Mr. Hutton, the retired director, twirling his car keys, enveloping tiny Miss Bell, the older teacher, in the warm offer of a ride home, and behind him, jolly Mrs. Hutton, a Galilean in full fury sail, doing the same with limp Mrs. Pettigrew, the postmistress. Assorted village children scampered out of the door, escaping their best-hatted mothers, rushing to the snowballs and Christmas turkey. Lugubrious Mrs. Horniman stumped out next to Mrs. Stanton and Mary, busily foretelling doom. Will saw Mary, trying not to giggle, fall back to join Mrs. Dawson and her married daughter, with the 5-year-old grandson prancing gaily in gleaming new cowboy boots. The choir, coated and muffled, began to leave too, with cries of "Happy Christmas" and "See you on Sunday, Vicar," to Mr. Beaumont, who would be giving only this service here today, and the rest in his other parishes. The rector, talking music with Paul, smiled and waved vaguely. The church began to empty, as Will waited for his brother. He could feel his neck prickling, as though with the electricity that hangs strongly oppressive in the air before a giant storm. He could feel it everywhere. The air inside the church was charged with it. The rector, still chatting, reached out an absent-minded hand and turned off the lights inside the church, leaving it in a cold gray murk, brighter only beside the door where the whiteness of the snow reflected in. And Will, seeing some figures move towards the door out of the shadows, realized that the church was not empty after all. Down there by the little 12th century font, he saw Farmer Dawson, old George, and old George's son John, the smith, with his silent wife. The old ones of the circle were waiting for him, to support him against whatever lurked outside. Will felt weak for a moment as relief washed over him in a great warm wave. "All ready, Will?" said the rector genially, pulling on his overcoat. He went on, still preoccupied, to Paul. "Of course, I do agree the double concerto is one of the best. I only wish he'd record the unaccompanied Bach suites. Heard him do them in church in Edinburgh once, at the festival. Marvelous." Paul, sharper-eyed, said, "Is anything wrong, Will?" "No," Will said. "That is, no." He was typing desperately to think of something of getting the two of them outside the church before he came near the door himself. Before whatever might happen did happen. By the church door he could see the old ones move slowly into a tight group, supporting one another. He could feel the force now very strong, very close, all around. The air was thick with it. Outside the church was destruction and chaos in the heart of the dark, and he could think of nothing that he could do to turn it aside. Then as the rector and Paul turned to walk through the nave, he saw both of them pause in the same instant and their heads go up like the heads of wild deer on the alert. It was so late now. The voice of the dark was so loud that even humans could sense its power. Paul staggered as if someone had pushed him in the chest, and he grabbed a pew for support. "What is that?" he said huskily. "Rector, what on earth is it?" Mr. Beaumont had turned very white. There was a glistening of sweat on his forehead, though the church was very cold again now. "Nothing on earth, I think, perhaps," he said. "God forgive me." And he stumbled a few paces near the church door, like a man struggling through waves in the sea, and leaning forward slightly made a sweeping sign of the cross. He stammered out, "Defend us, thy humble servants, in all assaults of our enemies, that we, surely trusting in thy defiance, may not fear the power of any adversaries." Farmer Dawson said very quietly, but clearly, from the group beside the door, "No, Rector." The rector seemed not to hear him. His eyes were wide, staring out at the window. He stood transfixed. He shook like a man with fever. The sweat came running down his cheeks. He managed to half raise one arm and point behind him. "Vestry," he gasped out. "Book on table. Exercise." "Poor brave fellow," said John Smith in the old speech. "This battle is not for his fighting. He is bound to think so, of course, being in his church." "Be easy, Reverend," said his wife in English. Her voice was soft and gentle, strongly of the country. The rector stared at her like a frightened animal, but by now all his powers of speech and movement had been taken away. Pushing against the dark, Will came forward slowly. He touched Paul on the shoulder, and as he passed, looking into puzzled eyes and a face as twisted and helpless as the rector's, and said softly, "Don't worry. It'll be all right soon." Each of the old ones touched him gently as he came into the group, as if joining him to them, and Farmer Dawson took him by the shoulder. He said, "We must do something to protect those two, Will, or their minds will bend. They cannot stand the pressure. The dark will send them mad. You have the power, and the rest of us do not." It was Will's first intimation that he could do anything another old one could not. But there was no time for wonder. With the gift of grammar, he closed off the minds of his brother and the rector, and behind a barrier that no one of any kind could break through. It was a perilous undertaking, since he the maker, was the only one who could remove the barrier, and if anything were to happen to him, the two protected ones would be left like vegetables, incapable of any communication, forever. But the risk had to be taken. There was nothing else to be done. Their eyes closed gently, as if they had gone quietly to sleep. They stood very still. After a moment their eyes opened again, but were tranquil and empty, unaware. "All right," said Farmer Dawson. "Now."